Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us on yet another Tuesday on Amogate Radio Communications as we continue this very exciting and illuminating topic that is roadmap to organizational strategy. It's been a joy, it's been a pleasure, it's been a delight, going along the dime cycle with you and sometimes extending it into the dimer cycle. For those who are just joining us and who have not yet been with us, first of all, my name is Tolu Amadara, and it's a joy to have you here on Amoge Radio Communications. Then the DIME cycle we have been on simply stands for developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating your strategy. I repeat, developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating your strategy. However, when you monitor and evaluate specifically this last two segment of the cycle, the reason you do all that is so that you can reinvent your strategy when necessary, and that's when the dime becomes the dimer. So the core of the cycle is the dime. You have to first develop your strategy, articulate your strategy, and that often begins with internal and external environmental assessment. What are your internal strengths? What are your internal weaknesses? The ones you can control for easily. And what are the external opportunities and threats? The ones you cannot necessarily control for easily, but can either take advantage of if they are positive or manage your way around if they are not so positive, right? So that often is the beginning of your strategy creation. What exactly do you do well? And that's why we emphasize at the beginning of this program. I think it's time to remind us again, you do not have to be apologetic about your strengths, right? You cannot take full advantage of your strength you're apologetic about. You must be able to recognize your strengths and exploit them to the fullest, exploit them to the optimum, right? And ditto for your weaknesses. Neither should you be in quote and unquote organizational self-denial about your weaknesses. Right? Much as you cannot live in self-denial about your weaknesses as an individual, neither should you have an institutional self-denial when it comes to your weaknesses, right? It's important to also know these are the areas that we may not be so strong in and which we have some control over, which we can do something about, because the beginning of addressing these things is often admitting them. I repeat, the beginning of addressing those weaknesses, the ones you can control for, is often admitting them. So the reason we are saying all of this is to remind us of the dime cycle, right? You develop your strategy, and developing your strategy often begins with identifying your internal strengths and weaknesses, as well as your external opportunities and threats. That has been a framework, a strategy development framework, or a strategy articulation framework that has, to an extent, I would say, stood the test of time. That's a SWOT framework: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Now, once you develop your strategy, when you articulate your strategy, you must be able to implement your strategy. We spent, I think, 2 episodes ago, episode 8, we spent a lot of time on the challenges of strategy execution, emphasizing the reality of the significant gap between strategies that are articulated and those that actually get implemented. And unfortunately, as much as 60 to 90% of strategies were said to fail at the point of implementation, or were said to fail to make it to the point of implementation. That's not news to us in Amogate, but neither does it make us feel any better about it. Every time we look at the gap between strategy, articulation, and implementation, even with our clients, there's always a cause for concern. And I remember emphasizing a lot on that episode 8. If you want to check it out on our YouTube page, or if it's not yet been uploaded there, you can check it out on our MixLR page, episode 8 of Roadmap to Organizational Strategy on Amoge Radio Communications. It was one of the reasons why I emphasized significantly in that episode that that's why we do what we do in Amoge, because we've always been burdened about the strategy performance gap. Bridging the strategy performance gap, as a matter of fact, is one of the reasons we came into being. When you say what inspired the creation of Amoge, one of it is, of course, building transgenerational institutions. That's a core concern for us. How do we build institutions, organizations that transcend generations? That's something that is at the heart of what we do. However, tied to that is also bridging the strategy performance gap, right? Why is it that there's such a gap between strategies that are articulated and the ones that get implemented. Ditto for policies in the public sector. Why is there such a distance between policies that are articulated and the ones that get implemented as intended, right? Because there's also something called strategy as intended versus strategy as effected. I repeat, there's also a difference between strategy as intended and strategy as eventually effected. So it's important that as much as we do a beautiful job articulating strategy, documenting strategy, designing strategy, and so on and so forth, we also have to ensure that as much as possible it gets executed as planned, right? Now, when you do all of the developing and implementing of strategy, you must also do the monitoring and evaluation of strategy to the end that you can reinvent your strategy as appropriate, right? You can have what is called strategic responsiveness. And that was a focus of last week's episode. Last week, we spent time looking at what we call the need for strategic responsiveness, monitoring and evaluation of strategy. But the focus was the need for strategic responsiveness, right? And you achieved that through monitoring and evaluation of strategy. Some of the things you said last week. Why exactly are you going to monitor and evaluate your strategy if you are not going to adapt it? What's the point of investing in monitoring and evaluation? What's the point of creating a monitoring and evaluation framework? Why exactly would you invest time, financial resources, human resources, and so on and so forth? Sometimes goodwill capital. Why would you invest all of that into monitoring and evaluation only for you to be stuck in your ways and to refuse to take the feedback and act upon the feedback? So it's very important to know that the reason why you are carrying out monitoring and evaluation, the M&E of the DIME cycle, is so that you can reinvent your strategy and you can respond as appropriate. Now, we also try to lay the foundation for ambidexterity. We said responsiveness may not come without the exploratory aspect of ambidexterity. Ambidexterity is a value that we're very passionate about in Mamogate. Ambidexterity simply means the ability to use your typical and your other hand, or in other words, exploitation and exploration, right? Exploitation has to do with the areas where you have consolidated your strengths, and you should very well leverage your strengths. We already said that. We said it last week. We repeated it at the beginning of this week's episode. You cannot be apologetic about your strength. If there are frameworks you have built, if there are brands you have established, please, by all means, exploit them to the maximum, optimize them. That can be a strategy in itself. But having done that, you must also begin to explore. You must move beyond exploitation for exploration. And if you do not have that exploratory mindset, you may not be able to be strategically responsive, because even if the data is indicating the need to adapt, without that exploratory culture in your organization, you may not be able to adapt as necessary, right? So we said if you do not have an organizational culture and model that balances the exploitation of your current strengths with the exploration of your future possibilities, you may not be able to attain strategic responsiveness. I think that's worth a repeat. If you do not have an organizational culture and model, operating model, that balances the exploration of your current strength with the exploration of your future possibilities, you may not be able to attain strategic responsiveness. It's just a fact. You must develop an ambidextrous culture intentionally, deliberately. As a matter of fact, you may need to measure some leaders on how well they have been able to create that ambidextrous culture. My colleague Adequate Jaiba does a fantastic job with leadership competencies and organizational behavior. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but let me just drop it here. It's worth a mention that the job of leaders is to create a culture. Very, very important. It's the job of leaders to shape and reshape culture. So if this is that important, sometimes you may need to make it a performance indicator, a performance metric of some of your leaders to measure them on how much of an ambidextrous culture they have been able to create, either in their department or divisions or regions and so on and so forth, because they are responsible for shaping culture. Very, very, very important, right? We also said that strategic responsiveness is critical because of the ever-changing nature of the world we are in. If you don't know that, then you should not be operating in 21st century reality. Maybe you're in Stone Age, right? Just check the phone on your hand. It's just one of the signs of the ever-changing nature of the world we are in. So you must be responsive. Things are changing fast, right? Artificial intelligence is not a buzzword. It's a reality. You pick up that phone and you call your customer service. You may be chatting for the next 5 minutes with a machine and may not even be fully aware that it's a machine. Now, is there still the need for human contact? Definitely. We talk about the nexus between the human experience and automation. There definitely is the need. However, the truth is that technology is also making certain things much more efficient, and it's changing the nature of things. And that's just one aspect. There's so many others. That's why we talk about the VUCA world. It's much more volatile, much more uncertain, much more complex, and much more ambiguous. That is the reality. And because of that, your strategy cannot be static in an ever dynamic world, an increasingly dynamic world, right? So it's really important to keep your strategy responsive. And the reason we do monitoring evaluation is to be able to reinvent, to be able to respond. Very important. Now, not having a strategy that is responsive comes with huge costs. And that's why you need an ambidextrous approach and culture in your organization, right? A culture that is, exploring your current strengths to the maximum, optimizing your benefits, not being apologetic about your strengths, but also evaluating the market, responding to it, and interpreting the insights from the evaluation objectively. Very important. It's not enough to, evaluate your market, evaluate your customers, feedback, evaluate the changing nature of the environment of operations, and refuse to accept it and do anything about it. So strategic responsiveness refers to the adaptation of your strategy to everything that you are seeing, especially the critical things you're seeing. Once there are strong indicators that there are new realities and that those new realities have come to stay, then you certainly must take action and begin to respond appropriately. Those were some of the highlights of last week when we looked at the need for strategic responsiveness. Now, this week, we want to talk a little bit more about the basis of strategy review, right? The basis of strategy review. Because if we say that you have to be responsive, we also say that you have to evaluate, you have to monitor and evaluate, then it's important for us to kind of share certain highlights of strategy evaluation. How exactly do you conduct a strategy review? How do I review my strategy, right? So today we're going to look at basis of strategy review, defining the metrics. Basis of strategy review, defining the metrics. As I prepared for today's episode, I thought about two things. The first thing is that one, I felt the need to differentiate between monitoring and evaluating your strategic plan and monitoring and evaluating your strategy. I'll say that again. There is a need to differentiate between monitoring and evaluating your strategic plan and monitoring and evaluating your strategy. Very important. I can tell you that having done both at Amogate, we've done a lot of work on strategy, and we've also done a lot of work on strategic planning. Sometimes we see that people are not just unaware of the difference, but actually have a desire to know the difference, and that's what makes us glad, right? People genuinely want to know, especially at the senior level, like what exactly is the difference between your strategic plan and your strategy. And it's not too complex. It can be quite simple, but at the same time, very important, right? It's simple and yet it can be foundational. Now, of course, your strategic plan is much more detailed than your strategy, but your strategy kind of gives rise, your strategy births your strategic plan. So your strategy generally is the direction in which you're going. Remember at the beginning of this program, when we talked about organizational strategy, we said your strategy is like a beacon that guides decisions, right? It inspires action and it propels the collective efforts of members. One of the things to emphasize is that your strategy is like a guiding light. It serves as a compass, right? And that compass, of course, guides daily operations towards the fulfillment of the overarching goal. When you talk about strategy, it's often about that overarching direction. What is the direction in which we're going? Let me give you a simple example. So, you could look at the market, for instance, that you're trying to penetrate, and you say, okay, the general strategy, the overarching light, right? The beacon that will guide decision making for this market over the next period is going to be digitalization. I'm just using as an example. That can be your broad strategy, digitalization. Now, if you want to adopt that now you do not have to be a digital organization to adopt a digital strategy. Take note. Don't confuse it. It's just that as an organization, you may even be a marketing organization, you may be a communications organization, you may be a healthcare organization, but you may have made up your mind that, this is going to be our strategy for penetrating this market, digitalization. As an organization invested in healthcare, you may decide, for instance, to be more accessible, to be able to provide more tele support to patients, healthcare counseling. You may decide to say, okay, we are going to digitize, for instance, pharmaceutical operations. Instead of having people come to the pharmacy to pick their medications, you're going to have it dropped off. You may decide, for instance, that you're going to have more even I know this may sound strange, and that's why it's a strategy. You may decide, for instance, to have more Zoom care by doctors, right? Often patients will have to go physically to the hospital today for care, and you may say, no, we're going to have the opportunity of hybrid solutions where you can meet with your doctor over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever platform you're using, have that consultation with your doctor. And you say, well, what happens if I want to do tests? Yeah, sometimes you can actually have nurses come to the location where the patient is, right, and conduct those the ones that can be conducted. I know some machines will be huge and it won't be realistic to transport them to where the patient is, but that's why I said you might decide that your strategy will be hybrid care instead of just physical care for some patients and for some kind of issues that can lend themselves to hybrid care. I'm just hypothesizing, please don't, especially if you're a medical doctor listening to me, don't crucify me. But jokes apart, if you decide that I'm just trying to show you that you can adopt a digital strategy without necessarily being a digital organization. So if you decide that digitalization is your broad strategy, you would then have to break it down into a strategic plan. And this is where the alignment comes in, the unity of purpose comes in. Each department, each division, each unit would then begin to say, how does this overall strategy apply to me? How does it apply to my unit? How does it apply to my division? How does it apply to my department? How do I begin to interpret digitalization and implement it within my own scope of control? So you've said, but overall, the strategy is largely about the direction in which the organization is going, right? It's not the vision. Please take note. The strategy should be getting you closer and closer to the vision. The vision can be very, very long term, right? But the strategy should be an indication of the direction, the broad direction that the organization can take and that can guide the organization, that can lead the organization towards the attainment of that vision. Why is this important? Because the strategic plan, when I say why is this important, why is it important to kind of differentiate between your strategy and your strategic plan? Because the strategic plan can be heavy on details, and sometimes we spend a lot of time and other resources creating a strategic plan, which is beautiful, very, very important. The devil can be in the details, like they say. We talked about execution 2 weeks ago. If you're going to translate that overall organizational strategy into an implementable path, then you definitely are going to need more than the direction. You're going to need some details, just like your map. When you have the broad, you don't just, when you have the address and you're trying to navigate your way, eventually the map begins to break things down into details for you. The map begins to say turn left and turn right, and 20 meters down the road you have this and you have that, and all those things that we can relate with in today's world, right? So yes, you would need the details, especially for implementation. However, when it comes to monitoring and evaluation, to a very large extent, I would suggest that you monitor and evaluate the strategy first before you invest time in monitoring and evaluating the strategic plan. Please follow me carefully. Remember, to begin with, it is your strategy, the overall strategic direction, that should have birthed the strategic plan, which can be heavy on details, which should be heavy on details, right? But you can spend a lot of resources evaluating the strategic plan if you're not careful when the strategy has become outdated. Therefore, it's important, in my opinion, and believe me, we've done this for a while. Strategy is something we've invested the better part of the last 15 years into as an organization. We've done this with private sector organizations, we've done this with public sector organizations, we've done this locally, we've done this internationally. We know what we're talking about. right? Generally, you want to evaluate your overall strategy before you invest resources in the monitoring and evaluation of your strategic plan, because your strategic plan should have been derived from your overall strategy. And if your overall strategy is not working, you want to be careful how much resources you devote to evaluating the strategic plan if you have already decided by evidence that the overall strategy may not be working, right? Just put that, file that somewhere, and let's continue. So remember, there is a need to first, as much as possible, evaluate your overall strategy before you invest a lot of resources in evaluating your strategic plan. Having said that, whether it's your overall strategy or it's your strategic plan, you also want to understand the general process for strategy. Remember, we're looking at the basis of strategy review. How do I review my strategy? How do I know if my strategy is working? And remember, the writer for today's program is defining the metrics. I think when it comes to evaluating your strategy, this is where goal setting comes in, right? To begin with, your strategy will be tied to setting goals, right? I need to follow me very carefully here, because where you're going as an organization can and should be different from even where your competitors are going in a certain sense. Again, please follow me carefully. I repeat, where you're going as an organization can and should be different from what your seeming competitors are doing. I probably need to qualify that, because this is where vision comes in. Extremely important for you to know what exactly you are trying to birth. You may all appear to be in the same waters at the beginning, but you may be going to very different destinations. I want to use the analogy of a flight. Sometimes we get on a flight, and because it's more like a connecting flight, we all appear to be going to the same destination, but we're actually not going to the same destination. Once we arrive at a hub, HUB, what happens? We then all go in our different directions. Sometimes all of us are still on a joint or on the first leg of the flight, and you think you're all going to the same place. No, that's why your vision must be very clear. And this brings me to something else I thought was important to share on today's episode of the program. I highlighted it a couple of times last week, but I felt the need to drive it home this week. There is a difference between strategic responsiveness and reaction. I repeat, there is a difference between strategic responsiveness and reacting to the market, reacting to market changes, reacting to competitor moves. And that was why last week we kept emphasizing that, look, when we say you need to be strategically responsive, we are not saying you must react. Sometimes strategy takes time to produce. That's the truth. That's why it's a long term. To a very large extent, strategy can be long term. It's often not short term. And so in the process of awaiting the manifestation of what you have envisaged, remember, strategy has a lot to do with vision. So you have a vision. Based on that vision, you have arrived at a strategy, and based on that strategy, you have created a strategic plan, and you're implementing the plan. You cannot afford to react to changing market conditions. There's a difference between reacting and responding. And you may want to say, oh, Toby, what is the difference between reacting and responding? I said something last week I want to re-emphasize. I said, often you want to make sure that those changes have come to stay. Very, very, very important. When you are evaluating the market, when you're monitoring and evaluating the market, and you're trying to determine whether or not you need to respond to the changes in the market, one of the things you want to first now, this appears to be inherently conflicting, because one of the things you want to do is to ensure that it's not a fleeting change, but it's a change that has come to stay. Simultaneously, you also want to say, oh, but if I'm doing that, how then do I also stay ahead of the game? And honestly, this is where we have to talk about piloting. Very, very important. It's one thing we always encourage our clients to do. When you talk about innovation, right, and strategic responsiveness has a lot to do with innovation. When you talk about innovation, you're talking about being able to test the market. When you carry out your monitoring and evaluation, and you have some insights based on the data you have gathered, and you want to, more or less, especially if it's a large market, many times we advise that you try to pilot what it is that you are envisaging is the change. Create a pilot around it. Let me go back to the example I just gave, just by way of illustration. So I was talking about the need to, for instance, if you want to digitize healthcare more, right? You want to have enhanced possibilities for, providing either telehealthcare or hybrid healthcare. And you have a large market. You have a potential market of, let's say, 10,000 customers. I'm just saying it hypothetically. Let's say you're a healthcare chain and you're spread across the nation and you have about 10,000 clients, right? And you're located, for instance, in, let's say, 30 states. You can take a slice of the market. You can even take a social demographic of the market. You might not even just go by the geographic location alone. You might even say, you know what, we want to go with this generation. We don't want to go with the older people who are probably less likely to be inclined to telehealthcare. I want to start with the younger generation. Find what works. Test the market. Gather the data, right? And when you gather the data, you can pilot the model. That way, you are not necessarily reacting to the market, but you are responding to the drift in the market, and you're not necessarily overcommitting resources without first piloting, but at the same time, you're not behind in the game. Wow, this is still Tolo Modern. I'm gonna get ready communications. Today we are looking at the basis for strategy review, trying to look at the need to define the metrics. Very, very important. We define the metrics, right? And we kind of made it, a distinction between monitoring and evaluating your strategy and monitoring and evaluating your strategic plan. And we also felt the need, flowing from last week, to emphasize the difference between being reactive and being responsive to market changes, because strategy can be a very long-term game, and we feel the need to emphasize that so that you don't just jump out of a strategy because it appears not yet to have manifested. No, strategy can take time, and that's why another thing I want to talk about quickly is the need for milestones. Very, very, very important. The need for milestones in creating your monitoring and evaluation plan. What are some of the things you need to take note of? And this may be where we'll be stopping today for the sake of time, but I feel the need to just highlight those things. We will not be able to go deep into them, but there's a need to highlight how do you create a monitoring evaluation plan? What are steps in developing a monitoring evaluation framework? Remember, I talked about defining the metrics. Where do those metrics come from? It begins with setting clear objectives and outcomes. Very, very important, especially when it comes to the overarching strategy. To a very large extent, there must be few critical and defining outcomes that you expect of that strategy. They can, like we always say, especially on this program, we always say generally in Amogate, if you have too many strategic objectives, they are not strategic. And even more so on Roadmap to Organizational Strategy, we've emphasized it a lot. Those defining outcomes, in our opinion, we will say keep it to 3, maximum of 5. Very, very important, especially for monitoring and evaluating the overall strategy, not the strategic plan. Of course, strategic plans will have different objectives and different metrics and even different segments. Like I said, the strategic plan will be cascaded, like they say in performance, like you said in performance management, the strategic plan will be cascaded to different departments and divisions and regions and so on and so forth. So they would, interpret it and implement it, right? They will interpret the overarching strategy and implement it. What is my part in digitization if I'm marketing, for instance? What is my part in digitization if I'm operations? What is my part in digitization if I'm in finance? What is my part in digitization if I'm in, and so on and so forth, right? But for the overarching strategy, you want few critical metrics. Very, very important. Maximum of 5 if you ask, preferably 3. That is the beginning. In developing a monitoring and evaluation framework, you must define your key outcomes and objectives. Very, very, very important. Now, when you define, and I want you to follow me as graphically as possible, when you define the overall outcomes and objectives, the overall outcomes, there must now be key performance indicators for each of those outcomes. Extremely important again. So let's say, again, just speaking hypothetically, let's say the broad outcomes you have defined are 1, market share, 2, profit, or before profits, let's say market share, revenue, and profit. I'm just speaking hypothetically. Those are the 3 critical metrics. market share, revenue, and profit. Those are the outcomes. Now remember, because strategy can be a long-term game and you want to be sure you're in the right direction, what do you want to do? You also want to have key performance indicators and milestones. Very, very important. Much as you don't want to react and jump out of a working strategy because it takes time to, mature, you also want to have some signs that you're on the right path. Very important. That's where you need the milestones. Key performance indicators, especially per milestones. Very important. They must be connected to the overall outcomes. So let's take the issue of market share. Let's say you have a goal to increase your market share by, say, 10%. Again, I'm just speaking hypothetically. Let's say you have a goal to increase your market share by 10% in 3 years. Then at least in the first year, you must have increased the market share by, say, 1 to 2% at the minimum, even though you may not, achieve everything in completely divisible terms. In other words, because of the principle of sunk cost and the marginal propensity to increase. In other words, sometimes you invest a lot in the first couple of years and you may increase much more in the latter years than you will in the earlier years where you're investing a lot of sunk cost. So you may not say, because, and I hope I'm not sounding too deep, but just follow me carefully. You may not say, because I have a goal to increase by 10% in 10 years, I must increase by 1% in each of the years. No, sometimes by the principle of sunk cost, when you're investing a lot initially, you may even not have more than a 0.5% increase in the first year, because that's the year you are sinking a lot of cost, right? It's like building the foundation. You may look as if nothing is happening, but you're building a lot. And that's why I said you cannot be reacting and say you are responding. No, you're supposed to be responsive, but not reactionary. There's a whole difference between both, right? So once you define what is realistic in terms of the key performance indicators, in terms of desired outcome, especially at the beginning where you're laying the foundation, you can then begin to monitor on that basis, right? So you must know what to realistically expect in the first 2 years, then what to realistically expect in the next 2 years, what to realistically expect in the 5th year, and so on and so forth, all based on data and research and comparative analysis and so on and so forth, right? So don't forget, you have to define your overall outcomes, right? Once you define your overall outcomes, keep them as linear as possible. Select the key performance indicators per outcomes. Once you select the key performance indicators per outcomes, make sure they're measurable, very important. Then develop your data collection methods. Very, very important. How do I want to collect data, right? Sometimes you're going to collect data through surveys. Sometimes you're going to collect data through focus groups, have some focus group sessions with your clients and even with your to-be clients. What are your clients saying about you? What are those who are not using you yet saying about you? You can commission marketing organizations to do this, or those whose job it is to gather the data. But you don't have to do this all by yourself. And if you have a marketing that can do this directly to, by all means too, right? So you must have data collection methods. Very, very important. Also know what your baseline data is. Establish your baseline data. Very important. Where were we when we started, right? Set targets and milestones. I've hinted at this. Where do we want to be at the end of the first year? Where do you want to be at the end of the second and third year, and so on and so forth, right? Identify the milestones for progress tracking. You're not just setting targets and milestones, but you're tying setting key progress indicators to some milestones. Even if we are not here yet by year 1, we should be here by year 2. If you are not here by year 2, then it may mean the strategy is not working. Very important, right? Plan for data analysis, analyze the collected data, and make sure they are reporting the findings. Very, very important. There must be reporting mechanisms in order to be able to, then begin to interpret and act upon the data. Wow. I think this is how far we're going to be able to go into this edition of the program. Today, we have tried to look at basis for strategy review, and we had to lay the foundation by explaining the need to differentiate between the monitoring of your strategy and monitoring of your strategic plan. We also spoke about the need, the criticality of not being reactionary, right? When we talk about strategic responsiveness, it's not about reacting, it's about responding, right? And the reason why you cannot react is because strategy can can be a long-term game. It can be a mid to long-term game. Many times you may not see the immediate benefit of what you're doing, and so you must be realistic in your timelines. At the same time, you also have to ensure that you're on track, and that's where milestones come into play. Factoring the principle of sunk cost, you want to tie realistic KPIs, key performance indicators, to certain milestones just to be sure that you're on track. So at this note, we're going to draw a curtain on today's edition of the program. Thank you very, very much for being with us. Thank you for doing this with us. We hope that you have learned some things. We hope that you have learned some principles about monitoring and evaluating our strategy, which then helps you to be able to respond, to be strategically responsive, to ensure that you have strategic responsiveness without necessarily being reactionary. My name is Tolu Madara. It's been a joy, it's been a delight, it's been a pleasure doing this with us, doing this with you, and having you do this with us. Forward to hearing from you. Remember, we have different programs Monday through Friday on Mortgage Radio Communications, great programs on different issues, a broad array of issues brought to you by experts who are deep, who are broad, who are very versatile. You will do well to join us every 12 noon Eastern and 5 p.m. West African time, and 5 p.m. British summertime too. We look forward to hearing back from you. We look forward to having your feedback. It's important to us. Please also follow us on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and we will also soon be on TikTok. Until then, you can also check us out on YouTube. We have over 90 videos uploaded there for your learning and for your growth. Thank you so much for doing this with us. Until we see you same time, same station next week. Remember, think strategy and also think monitoring and evaluation. See you next week.